Everyone swore they were right. That's how I knew none of them were seeing anything. There was a conversation that started innocently enough. 3 people, 3 names, 3 perfectly reasonable perspectives, and not a single shared reality between them. Ezra was describing a woman named Lila, not introducing her, describing her, how she speaks, how she reacts, what she's like once you get to know her. Marlowe listened, nodded, then said something curious. "When you talk about Lila," he said, "I see one thing. But when you talk about her again a minute later, I see something else." Then he paused. "And when you mention that courtroom movie, the one with the jurors, I don't see the man on the stand at all. I see someone asking if the window can be opened." Same reference, different scene, different focus. Then Marlowe added one more wrinkle. "And there's Calder. You describe him one way, I see him another way entirely." That's when the real conversation started. Because once perception splits, there are only 2 possible paths forward. Either we argue about who's right, or we question what seeing even means. So I asked the only question that matters. Who's right? If Ezra sees Calder one way, and Marlowe sees Calder another way, and Calder would surely describe himself differently still, who's correct? The obvious answers don't survive scrutiny. If Ezra is right, Marlowe must be wrong. If Marlowe is right, Ezra must be mistaken. If they're both partially right, then there must be a stable Calder somewhere being approximated. But perception doesn't behave that way. Gravity doesn't change depending on who's talking about it. Fire doesn't shift based on childhood memory. But people do. Which tells you something immediately and unmistakably. No one is seeing Calder. They're seeing meaning. And meaning is not discovered. It's assigned. At first it feels reasonable to say, well, they're both right from their own perspective. But even that turns out to be too generous. Because perspective still assumes an object being viewed. And that's where the illusion hides. Ezra wasn't seeing Lila. He was seeing years of interaction. Her tone with their mother. The way she handled conflict. Old resentments he forgot were still active. Warmth he remembers when it suits him. Marlowe wasn't seeing Lila either. He was seeing a story delivered second-hand, filtered through his own history, his own associations, his own private symbols. They weren't disagreeing about the same woman. They were each watching a different internal film that happened to reuse the same name, same title card, different projection. And here's where the mind either tightens its grip or loosens it completely. Because I said something that tends to short-circuit people. If you see Lila one way, I can choose again and see her that way too. That sounds like empathy. It sounds like flexibility. But it's much more destabilizing than that. If perception were tied to reality, that wouldn't be possible. You can't choose to see fire as cold. You can't decide gravity works differently today. The fact that perception is adjustable proves it is not bound to truth, which leads to the only conclusion that actually resolves the problem. There is no Lila. There is no Ezra. There is no Marlowe. There is no Calder. There is no world being correctly perceived. That's not nihilism. That's the end of the argument. Because the moment the world is insisted upon as real, the question, who's right, becomes unavoidable and unanswerable. Everyone becomes a juror, arguing over evidence that can't be verified. Every disagreement turns into a trial. Every relationship becomes a defense strategy. But if the world were created by God, perception wouldn't fracture like this. Reality doesn't need witnesses to stabilize it. So the problem was never differing viewpoints. The problem was believing perception was seeing something there. Once that belief is withdrawn, the conflict collapses on its own. No one has to win. No one has to be corrected. No one has to defend their story, because there was never a shared object to disagree about in the first place. And that's why the question, who's right, dissolves instead of being answered. Not because everyone is correct, but because nothing they were pointing at was ever there. If it were real, everyone would see it the same way. Every time, from every angle, without exception. They don't. And that's not the failure. That's the evidence.